Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Mirror's Reflection. Holly Arnold had never believed in omens. She was pragmatic, rooted in reality, and skeptical of anything that even hinted at the supernatural. So, when she inherited an antique mirror from her estranged grandmother, she regarded it as nothing more than a peculiar family heirloom, a relic that belonged to a past era, much like her grandmother herself. The mirror arrived at her home on the Isle of Wight on a stormy evening, the wind howling through the cracks in the windows as if mourning the passing of its previous owner. Holly lived alone in a small, secluded cottage on the outskirts of Ventnor, surrounded by dense woods and the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs. The isolation suited her. She preferred the quiet, the stillness that allowed her to think and create. Holly was an artist, her works often reflecting the wild beauty of the island, the rugged landscapes, and the haunting sea. The mirror was delivered in an ornate wooden crate, the wood aged and splintered, as though it had been hidden away for centuries. As Holly pried the lid open, a strange, musty odor wafted out, a scent that reminded her of old books and damp cellars. Inside, wrapped in yellowed linen, was the mirror. It was tall, nearly as tall as she was, framed in dark, intricately carved wood that twisted and curled like the roots of an ancient tree. At the top of the frame, two carved serpents intertwined, their eyes small rubies that glinted in the dim light. Holly stood the mirror against the wall in her bedroom, admiring the craftsmanship, but feeling an odd sense of unease as she did. The glass was slightly warped, giving the reflection a subtle, distorted quality, as if the person staring back wasn't quite her but someone else, someone older, wiser, and perhaps more sinister. Over the next few days, Holly found herself inexplicably drawn to the mirror. She would catch herself standing in front of it, gazing into its depths, her eyes tracing the curves of the frame, the gleam of the ruby eyes, the slight ripple in the glass. At first, the reflections were ordinary, mundane, just her, alone in her room, surrounded by the familiar objects of her life. But then the visions began. It started with a flicker, a brief flash of movement that caught her eye as she passed by. Holly paused, thinking it a trick of the light, but as she looked closer, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. The reflection was no longer just her in the present, it was her in the future. She saw herself standing by the window, wearing a dress she didn't own, her hair longer than it was now. She was holding something in her hand, a small, silver locket that she recognized as the one her grandmother had always worn. Curiosity overcame her initial apprehension, and she began to watch the mirror more closely. Each time, the visions grew clearer, more detailed, revealing glimpses of her life that had yet to unfold. She saw herself receiving a letter in the mail, its contents hidden from view, but her reaction one of deep sadness. She saw herself walking along the cliffs, the wind tugging at her hair, her expression somber, as though weighed down by some heavy burden. As the days passed, the visions became more frequent, more vivid. They showed her attending a funeral, though she couldn't see whose it was. She saw herself crying in her bed, her body racked with sobs, her face pale and drawn. And then she saw herself in the mirror, staring back at her reflection, but something was wrong. The woman in the mirror was not her, not exactly. She was older, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes hollow and haunted. And she was smiling a cold, cruel smile that sent a chill down Holly's spine. The visions began to take a darker turn after that. Holly saw herself in her studio, painting furiously, the colors on the canvas dark and chaotic, unlike anything she had ever created before. The reflection showed her hands stained with red paint, though she hadn't been using any. The locket appeared again, but this time it was open, revealing a photograph that she couldn't quite make out. It seemed to be of a woman, her features blurred, but there was something disturbingly familiar about her. One night, as Holly lay in bed, she heard a soft whispering sound, like someone speaking just out of earshot. She turned on the light, her eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there. The sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent, until she realized it was coming from the mirror. Trembling, she got up and approached the mirror, the whispers growing louder with each step. When she was close enough to touch the glass, the whispering stopped, and the reflection changed. This time, the vision was of her standing at the edge of a cliff, the wind whipping her hair around her face. She was staring down at the rocks below, her expression one of utter despair. In her hand, she held the locket, the photograph now clear. It was of a young woman, beautiful and radiant, her smile filled with life and joy. Holly recognized her as her grandmother, but younger, much younger than she had ever known her. The reflection shifted again, showing Holly taking a step forward, closer to the edge, her face contorted with pain and sorrow. She watched in horror as her reflection dropped the locket, watching it tumble down the cliff, the sound of its impact lost in the roar of the sea. The vision ended with her stepping off the edge, her body plummeting into the void. Holly stumbled back from the mirror, her heart racing, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. What was happening to her? Why was the mirror showing her these things? She had always believed in logic, in reason, but this was something beyond her understanding. Determined to make sense of it, Holly began researching the history of the mirror. She contacted antique dealers, historians, anyone who might know something about its origins. The answers she found were unsettling. The mirror had belonged to a long line of women in her family, passed down through generations, each woman experiencing strange and tragic events after acquiring it. Some had gone mad, others had disappeared, and a few had died under mysterious circumstances. The most recent owner, her grandmother, had become reclusive in her final years, refusing to see anyone, even Holly. Holly's research revealed that the mirror was said to be cursed, a conduit for dark forces that preyed on the fears and desires of those who gazed into it. The visions it showed were not merely glimpses of the future, they were warnings, twisted reflections of what could be, what would be if the mirror's influence was not resisted. The more one looked into the mirror, the stronger its hold became, feeding off the soul of its owner until nothing remained but a hollow shell, a reflection of the darkness within. Holly tried to resist the pull of the mirror, to ignore the visions and the whispers, but it was too late. The mirror had taken root in her mind, its tendrils wrapping around her thoughts, her dreams, her very soul. She found herself drawn to it, unable to stay away, even as she knew it was leading her down a path of despair and destruction. The final vision came on a cold, stormy night, much like the one when the mirror had first arrived. Holly stood before the mirror, her reflection staring back at her with that same cruel smile. This time, the vision showed her standing in her grandmother's old bedroom, the locket clutched in her hand. The room was dark, the only light coming from a single candle on the dresser. She could hear the wind howling outside, the sound of the sea crashing against the cliffs. But there was something else, too, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of footsteps approaching. Holly's reflection turned toward the door, her eyes wide with fear. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. It was a woman, tall and thin, her face obscured by shadows. But Holly knew who it was. She had seen that face in the photograph in her dreams. It was her grandmother, but twisted, deformed, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The reflection showed Holly backing away, her hand tightening around the locket, her breath coming in short, panic gasps. The figure moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring the terror it was causing. Holly's reflection screamed, a sound of pure, unbridled terror that echoed through the room. The figure reached out, its hand closing around Holly's throat, and the vision went black. Holly awoke the next morning, her body drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. The mirror stood silent and still, its surface reflecting the pale light of dawn. But Holly knew that the vision had not been a dream, it was a warning, a final glimpse of what awaited her if she did not escape the mirror's grip. Desperate, she decided to rid herself of the mirror once and for all. She couldn't destroy it, it was too powerful, too ancient. But she could bury it, hide it away where it could never harm anyone again. She packed the mirror back into its crate, sealing it tightly, and drove to the cliffs where the final vision had taken place. The wind was fierce as she stood at the edge, the sea raging below, the sky dark and foreboding. She took the crate to a secluded spot deep within the woods and began to dig. The earth was cold and unyielding, but Holly's determination drove her on. Finally, she placed the crate in the hole, covering it with dirt, burying it deep beneath the earth. As she stood over the freshly dug grave, a sense of relief washed over her. The mirror was gone, entombed in the ground where it could no longer torment her. She whispered a final farewell, hoping that the sack would break the mirror's curse. But as Holly turned to leave, she felt a strange sensation, a prickling at the back of her neck. She glanced around, the trees swaying in the wind, their branches creaking ominously. The feeling persisted, a sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. She shook her head, dismissing it as nerves, and began the long walk back to her cottage. That night Holly slept fitfully, her dreams filled with shadows and whispers, but no visions came. When she awoke, the sun was shining, the storm had passed, and the island seemed peaceful again. She tried to return to her normal routine, throwing herself into her work, painting landscapes that were vibrant and full of life, a stark contrast to the dark visions that had plagued her. For a few weeks, life seemed to return to normal, and Holly began to believe that she had finally escaped the mirror's curse. But the sense of unease never fully left her. It was always there, lurking in the back of her mind, a quiet voice that whispered doubts and fears. She avoided mirrors as much as possible, unable to shake the feeling that they might betray her, show her something she didn't want to see. Even in the reflection of the sea or the windows of her cottage, she found herself looking away, afraid of what might be waiting there. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of red and orange, Holly sat on her porch, watching the waves crash against the cliffs in the distance. The wind carried the scent of salt and earth, and for a moment she felt a strange peace, as if the world had finally returned to its natural order. She sipped her tea, letting the warmth soothe her nerves, when she noticed something strange. There was a figure standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the fading light. Holly squinted, trying to make out who it was, but the figure remained still, shrouded in shadows. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that the figure was watching her, its gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Holly stood up, her heart pounding, but the figure did not move. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the gloom, but there was something familiar about its stance, the way it held itself. She stepped forward, calling out, "Who's there?" but the wind swallowed her words, carrying them away into the night. The figure took a step forward, and Holly's breath caught in her throat. The setting sun cast a sliver of light across its face, revealing the same cruel, twisted smile that had haunted her visions. It was her grandmother, or rather, the distorted version of her that Holly had seen in the mirror. Panic surged through her as she backed away, stumbling over the threshold of her cottage. She slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. The figure made no move to follow her, but Holly could feel its presence outside, waiting, watching. She raced through the cottage, drawing the curtains, turning on every light, as if the brightness could ward off the darkness creeping into her life. She huddled in the center of the room, clutching the locket that had belonged to her grandmother, the metal cool against her skin. The hours dragged on, the night deepening around her, but Holly could not shake the feeling that she was not alone. The silence of the cottage was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the faint rustling of the wind outside. As the clock struck midnight, a soft knock echoed through the cottage, the sound so gentle it was almost as if it were coming from within the walls themselves. Holly froze, her heart racing, her eyes wide with terror. The knock came again, this time a little louder, a little more insistent. She knew, deep down, that it was the mirror. Somehow, it had not been destroyed or buried, its curse had not been broken. It had merely been waiting, biding its time until she was vulnerable enough for it to strike again. The knock sounded a third time, and Holly felt the locket in her hand grow warm, almost burning against her palm. With shaking hands, she opened the locket, revealing the photograph of her grandmother. The woman in the picture stared back at her, the once soft features now twisted into a sneer. Holly gasped, dropping the locket as if it had burned her, and the knock came again, louder, more demanding, as if it were right outside the door. Summoning all her courage, Holly grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the sound. The air in the cottage felt thick, oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on her. She reached the front door, her hand trembling as she grasped the doorknob. Taking a deep breath, she threw the door open, shining the light into the darkness beyond. There was nothing there. Just the empty porch, the darkened woods, and the distant sound of the sea. Holly sagged against the door frame, relief flooding through her. Perhaps it had all been in her mind, a product of her fear and exhaustion. But as she turned to close the door, the flashlight beam caught something on the ground, a small, dark object lying just outside the threshold. Holly frowned, kneeling down to pick it up. It was an old, tarnished key, its surface worn smooth by time. As she held it in her hand, a cold dread washed over her. She had seen this key before in her grandmother's house, in the vision of the room with the single candle. It was the key to the mirror's original box. Holly's hand trembled as she clutched the key, her mind racing. Why was this here? Who had brought it? And then the realization hit her with the force of a sledgehammer. The mirror had never been buried. It had never been hidden away. Somehow it had found its way back to her, or perhaps it had never left. Desperation clawed at Holly as she stumbled back into the cottage, the key clutched tightly in her hand. She knew what she had to do. The mirror had to be found, had to be destroyed, truly destroyed this time, before it could claim her soul completely. She drove through the night, the dark road winding through the island like a serpent, leading her back to the place where it had all begun. The old house, her grandmother's house, loomed in the distance, its windows dark and lifeless, like the eyes of a corpse. The house had been abandoned for years, left to rot after her grandmother's death, but now it seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if it were waiting for her. Holly parked the car and approached the house, the key cold and heavy in her hand. The front door creaked open as she touched it, as if inviting her inside. The air was thick with dust and decay, the scent of mildew and rot overpowering her senses. The house was silent, but she could feel the presence of the mirror, a dark weight pressing down on her, guiding her steps. She made her way to the upstairs bedroom, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. The door to the bedroom was ajar, the room beyond it dark and still. Holly hesitated for a moment, fear gnawing at her, but she knew there was no turning back. She pushed the door open, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, revealing the room exactly as she had seen it in her vision. The mirror stood in the center of the room, uncovered, its surface reflecting the flickering light of the single candle on the dresser. Holly approached it slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The reflection in the mirror was not her own. It was the twisted version of her grandmother, the same cruel smile playing on her lips, her eyes glowing with a sickly light. Holly held up the key, her hand shaking. The reflection in the mirror laughed, a sound that echoed in the empty room, a sound that was both familiar and utterly alien. It was a laugh that belonged to the mirror, to the darkness that dwelled within it. With a surge of determination, Holly rushed forward, aiming the key at the heart of the mirror, intending to shatter it, to destroy it once and for all. But as the key touched the glass, the mirror's surface rippled, as if it were made of liquid. The reflection's hand shot out, grabbing Holly's wrist with a grip like iron. Holly screamed, struggling to pull away, but the reflection's grip was unbreakable. She could feel the cold seeping into her skin, the darkness pulling her in, dragging her toward the mirror's surface. The reflection grinned, its eyes blazing with a malevolent light, and with a final, desperate cry, Holly was pulled into the mirror, the glass swallowing her whole. The room fell silent once more, the candle flickering out, plunging the room into darkness. The mirror stood alone, its surface smooth and unbroken, reflecting the empty room. The reflection of Holly stood within the mirror, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream, but there was no one left to hear her. The mirror had claimed another soul. Weeks passed, and Holly's cottage on the Isle of Wight remained empty, her disappearance a mystery that would never be solved. The mirror, hidden away in the old house, would wait, as it had always done. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.